Oh, you think you know the Aztecs? Think again. Beyond the towering pyramids and golden artifacts lies a truth far darker than any Hollywood depiction. What if I told you their entire social structure, their very survival, hinged on a practice so horrific, it makes modern understanding real? Prepared to uncover the chilling, often overlooked, role of slavery in the Aztec Empire, and how it intertwined with their insatiable demand for human sacrifice. Imagine standing in the heart of the jewel of the Aztec Empire, where canals shimmer in the sun and markets buzz with life. The city hums with power, an empire at its zenith, its rulers draped in jade and gold. From afar, it looks like a civilization of extraordinary beauty and achievement. But as you step closer, behind the vibrant masks and music, shadows stretch long across the streets. Beneath the surface lies an invisible chain, a brutal system of bondage, feeding the empire's hunger for blood. Slavery in the Aztec world was not hidden. It was woven into daily life, a silent machinery that kept the empire alive. But unlike in some parts of the world, Aztec slavery carried a fate even more chilling. For many enslaved, the end was not simply endless toil, but sacrifice upon the stone altars of the gods. Their bondage was not only a loss of freedom, was a countdown to death. This practice wasn't random cruelty. The Aztecs believed that human sacrifice kept the universe itself alive. They taught that the sun would falter without nourishment, that the gods demanded human hearts to ensure the world's continuation, and so, the empire's survival depended on a constant stream of lives, offered up in gruesome ceremonies witnessed by thousands. Where would they find those bodies? The answer reveals the darkest intertwining of slavery and faith. Conquered peoples bore the heaviest burden. When Aztec armies swept across Mesoamerica, they didn't simply take land, they took captives. These captives were paraded back into not as permanent laborers, but as fuel for the sacrificial fires. The unlucky ones were bound, displayed, and eventually marched up the steep steps of the Templo Mayor, where priests wielding obsidian blades opened their chests to the sky. The empire thrived on conquest, not only for tribute, but for the steady harvest of human beings to feed their gods. Slavery became a conveyor belt leading straight to the altar. But the story does not end with prisoners of war. The Aztecs had another mechanism, one far more insidious, to ensure the flow of blood never stopped. Within their own society, people could fall into slavery through debt, crime, or betrayal. A father desperate to pay a tax might sell his child into bondage. A woman abandoned might find herself sold off by her husband. Even those who committed minor offenses risked being cast into slavery. And from there, the line between servitude and sacrifice grew dangerously thin. Imagine the despair of knowing that a mistake, a debt, or simple bad luck could turn you into an offering to the gods. It is here that we must pause and reflect. For what we see in this system is more than just ritual, it is the crushing machinery of dehumanization. The enslaved became a resource, stripped not only of dignity but of identity. They were reduced to a purpose. To be consumed, their names vanished in the roar of the crowd, their lives extinguished to affirm the empire's power. And yet, what chills us even more is the normalization of this cycle. For the Aztec elite, sacrifice was not an atrocity but an honor, a divine necessity. Priests spoke of it as nourishment for the gods, while rulers staged it as spectacle. Imagine the drums beating, the incense rising, and the crowd chanting as bodies tumbled down the temple stairs. What we see as horror, they framed as duty. It was justice, in their eyes, for keeping the sun alive. But let us ask, justice for whom? Not for the enslaved, not for the captives, not for those born into bondage through no fault of their own. Their voices were silenced long before the obsidian knife pierced their chest. They were the forgotten, the invisible, those whose lives were deemed expendable. History often celebrates the grandeur of the Aztec Empire, their architecture, astronomy, and artistry, yet rarely do we linger on the cusp. That cusp was measured in bodies, in lives stolen, in blood spilled across the stone temples and this is where the human touch matters most. Because behind every statistic, behind every number carved into history, was a person. A young man taken from his village, longing for his mother's face one last time. A woman forced into slavery, her child torn away, both destined for sacrifice. A father sold into bondage by a desperate family, walking the long path up the temple steps, his heart pounding with fear, knowing his life would soon be over. These stories remind us that slavery was not simply a system, it was lived, endured, and suffered by countless human beings whose dignity was denied. This is why we must resist the temptation to view the Aztecs only through the lens of their grandeur. To admire the pyramids without remembering the blood that stained their stones is to erase the enslaved, the sacrificed, the silenced. History, when stripped of its human toll, becomes a lie of convenience. And yet, even in this darkness, there is something deeply human to recognize: the resilience of those who endured. For even as they faced bondage, even as they walked toward sacrifice, they carried memories, love, and dreams. They were more than victims, they were people whose existence demands remembrance. Now pause for a moment. Think of the irony. The Aztecs believed that human sacrifice sustained the sun, that without it, darkness would consume the world. But what if the opposite was true? What if their relentless hunger for blood ensured their own destruction? For when the Spanish arrived, they found allies among the very peoples who had been enslaved and sacrificed. Centuries of resentment had built an undercurrent of rage. The system that had sustained the Aztec Empire ultimately weakened it. For the oppressed became the willing accomplices of its downfall. In this way, the cries of the enslaved did not vanish. They echoed, shaping history's course in ways the rulers could never have foreseen. And so, as we peel back the gilded mask of the Aztec Empire, we are left with questions that reach far beyond ancient Mexico. How do societies justify brutality in the name of survival? How do leaders transform oppression into spectacle until cruelty appears sacred? And most importantly, how do we remember the lives of those silenced by such systems? These questions matter, not just for the Aztecs, but for every history of slavery and sacrifice. They force us to confront the ways in which human dignity has been denied, and to reckon with the echoes of injustice that ripple into our present. This was not just an Aztec story. It is a human story, one of power and oppression, of faith twisted into justification, of lives reduced to shadows. And it is a reminder, too, of why remembrance matters. For the enslaved of the Aztec Empire, we must tell their story, not in numbers or rituals, but in human terms. They deserve to be seen, to be heard, to be honored not as fuel for the gods, but as people whose lives had meaning. As we step deeper into this story, we arrive at the twilight of the Aztec Empire, where the echoes of drums and chants collide with the march of foreign boots. When and his Spanish soldiers landed on the shores of Mexico, they encountered not just a powerful empire, but a fractured world. For centuries, countless villages and nations had lived under the shadow of Aztec dominance. They paid tribute in gold, crops, and most horrifying of all human lives. Their sons and daughters had been taken, enslaved, and sacrificed upon the altars of to these peoples. The arrival of the Spaniards was not simply an invasion, it was an opportunity. The brutality of the Aztec system, especially the relentless demand for sacrificial victims, had left deep scars. Thousands of indigenous communities, weary of slavery and bloodshed, turned against their Aztec overlords. And so, the empire that seemed invincible, girded by its mighty temples and warriors, found itself vulnerable not because of European strength alone, but because of the resentment festering within its own foundations. The voices of the enslaved, long silenced by the obsidian blade, returned in a roar of vengeance through alliances that toppled the empire. This collapse forces us to look again at the paradox of power built on dehumanization. For every empire that thrives on the subjugation of others, there is a reckoning. The Aztecs, like so many regimes throughout history, believed their system eternal. They could not imagine that the very practice they saw as holy, the sacrifice of human lives, would breed the bitterness that dismantled their world. History teaches us again and again, injustice may sustain an empire for a time, but it cannot preserve it forever. But let us not mistake the Spanish conquest as salvation. The fall of the Aztec Empire did not bring liberation for the enslaved, it merely transformed one kind of bondage into another. Where the Aztecs once demanded sacrificial victims, the Spanish soon demanded forced labor. Where temples once echoed with the cries of the condemned, mines and plantations now rang with the groans of those shackled under colonial chains. In place of obsidian knives came whips and muskets, and a new economy of exploitation took root. The cycle of dehumanization simply changed hands, and this is where we must return to the human touch, the reminder that behind every system of slavery, whether Aztec or European, are real people caught in the gears. Think of the child in an Aztec village, knowing each year her people must send captives or risk annihilation. Think of the young man captured in war, dragged miles to a city he had never seen, knowing he would not live long enough to return home. Then think of their descendants, who after the conquest were forced into colonial mines, their labor feeding Spain's hunger for silver and gold. Their chains took new forms, but the weight remained crushing. The Aztec story, then, is not isolated. It is part of a broader human story of how societies justify cruelty in the name of survival, power, or faith. For the Aztecs, sacrifice was sacred necessity. For the Spanish, forced labor was the natural order of empire. In both, the enslaved bore the cost. And when we look at these histories side by side, a deeper question emerges. Why is it always the powerless whose blood is demanded to keep the powerful secure? This question stretches across continents and centuries, connecting the Aztec temples to the slave ships that would soon cross the Atlantic. Both reveal systems that robbed people of dignity, reduced them to resources, and consumed their lives for someone else's vision of greatness. It is in this connection that we must confront a sobering truth. Slavery, in its many forms, is one of humanity's darkest recurring patterns. The faces change, the justifications shift, but the essence remains the same: the denial of humanity to sustain power. And yet, within this darkness, there is always resistance. We must not imagine the enslaved of the Aztec Empire as silent victims who accepted their fate without thought. Even in bondage, even in the face of sacrifice, many resisted. Some escaped, fleeing into mountains or forests. Others fought back when the opportunity arose, striking at their captors. And though most could not change their fate, the memory of their suffering carried forward, fueling the alliances that helped dismantle the empire. Their voices, though muted in life, thundered in history's turning. Here lies a lesson we cannot ignore. Every act of dehumanization, every system of slavery, carries within it the seeds of its own undoing, because people, no matter how oppressed, never stop longing for dignity. That longing may be silenced, suppressed, or buried under fear, but it endures. And when the moment comes, it can erupt with a force that topples empires. The Aztecs learned this too late. Others have learned it since. The pattern repeats, again and again, until we choose to break it. Now imagine standing once more before the great Templo Mayor, its steps stained by centuries of blood. The empire has fallen, its gods silenced, its rulers overthrown, yet the stones remain, whispering of the lives taken there. If you listen closely, you might hear not the chants of priests, but the unspoken stories of those who climbed those steps in chains. Their voices remind us that history is not only the tale of rulers and empires, but of the forgotten, the silenced, the enslaved. This is why telling these stories matters, not to sensationalize the horror, but to humanize the people erased by it. For too long, history has marveled at the splendor of the Aztecs, while turning away from the suffering beneath. Just as too often history marvels at the wealth of empires, while ignoring the enslaved hands that built them. By remembering the enslaved of the Aztec Empire, we honor not the system that destroyed them, but the humanity they carried even to their final breath. So, when we ask, what was the Aztec Empire? Let us not answer only with pyramids, warriors, and gold. Let us answer with truth. It was a civilization built on brilliance and brutality, artistry and atrocity, faith and fear. And at its core was a dark reliance on slavery and sacrifice, a reliance that ultimately became its downfall. But let us also ask, what does this mean for us today? Because history is never just about the past, it is a mirror. When we examine the Aztecs' justification for slavery and sacrifice, we see echoes in our own time. We see how societies can normalize cruelty, how faith or ideology can be twisted into tools of oppression, how leaders can mask brutality as necessity. These are not ancient questions, they are eternal ones. And so, the story of the Aztec Empire's dark slavery is not only about Mexico, not only about the 15th century, it is about us all, of us confronting the ways in which humanity has denied itself dignity, and the ways in which we can choose differently. It calls us to remember that every life, no matter how small, carries meaning. That no person should be reduced to fuel for power, whether on a temple altar or in the machinery of modern oppression. As the sun sets over the ruins of casting long shadows across the stones, we are left with a choice. We can look away, content to marvel at the past's grandeur, or we can listen to the whispers of those enslaved, sacrificed, forgotten. If we choose the latter, We do more than remember. We restore dignity to the silenced, and we learn how to build a future where no empire rests upon chains and blood. Because in the end, the greatest honor we can give the enslaved of the Aztec Empire is not to retell the spectacle of their deaths, but to affirm the humanity of their lives.